letter asking, look, if, that this should be thrown out or vacated because blah, blah, there's no evidence that so-and-so is a taxpayer and blah, And if you disagree, then there's two standard questions that I've raised on the show so many times, and they are, one, are there any witnesses of personal first-hand knowledge that I'm a taxpayer, that I have taxable income, and then the second one is there any admissible evidence that I'm a taxpayer and have taxable income and that. And so the guy, Tom, had sent a letter back that was your basic response, that the law says this, right? That's what you get? This is what the law, there's no reference directly to anything in your letter, though. And so he called me, which is unfortunate because I was not able to record this, because if I did, I wouldn't be rambling right now. We'd be playing that clip. So, so he said, well, if you want to respond in writing, you can do that. And I said, well, before we do that, I'd like you to tell me that if I do this, you will be responsive to these two questions. And he says, well, I will respond to your letter. That's not what I'm getting at, though. Okay, I'm sure you'll respond, but I want it to be responsive. Before I go through the trouble of sending all that, I will respond to your letter. Okay, so we're in the telemarketer phase now, where he's just, kind of going off the same script that you've heard a million times, Larken, where they just won't answer. And I said, look, I don't really think you're understanding what I'm getting at here. I would like for you, and he finishes my sentence, to commit. And he starts laughing. I know what you're trying to do. I said, no, I'm not asking you to commit to a certain answer, just that your answer will be yes or no. Mm-hmm. And so he actually committed. So he did commit to that. He committed he would answer the yes or no. And so this is my long-winded way of saying, that I'm well aware and acquainted with the me non-responsive, that they don't answer any of the questions.
Right.
And so we've covered this on the show before, where Larken, you were trying to show that even given their own rules, they won't follow their own rules.
Right. I'm actually about to do because occasionally people now ask me, well, how come you don't talk about that anymore? And I'm actually going to post a YouTube thing, maybe half an hour long, saying why I don't bother talking about it much these days, and going through just some of the pieces of evidence we have. And somebody just sent me a copy of a USA Today story, quote unquote, which was a direct quote from the IRS propaganda, and it has this list of these frivolous arguments. And what it has to say about 861 is the same thing, the same completely bogus thing they've been saying for years and years and years. And so I'm making a video to point out the evidence that they have never mentioned. Not just they haven't done a decent rebuttal, they never mention it anywhere, and there's a lot of it. Things that are very specific, like a regulation that says that there are some kinds of income which are, under the Constitution, not taxable by the federal government, and they're not subject to the income tax. I mean, the regulations just said that. And so the obvious question is, well, what's that talking about? Is that any of my income? And no IRS letter, no ruling, no court ruling at any level ever has even mentioned that the regulations ever said that, much less come up with some explanation for it. And the number of things they just don't talk about at all is just amazing. And it just demonstrates, we have this huge pile of evidence that they've never responded to in any way, never even mention it, because they know if we just don't talk about it, most people will never know it exists. And that's good enough for most people. And at my trial, I showed them all those pieces of evidence, and I told them how they never respond to it, and it didn't matter to the jury. All they care about is, you didn't do what you were told. And it's pathetic that you can have evidence and the other side doesn't even need to mention it. They can just say, no, you're wrong.
Well, that's true, because what I think it comes down to, and this is one of the main reasons why I don't like to use issues of law, and I'm not saying that you were incorrect as to that. It's just when you see the lack of effectiveness of using that in court, because I think what the jury is responding to is the personalities. And they're, you mentioned blind faith or trust earlier, and that is something that I believe that the jury tends to have with the judge. Mm-hmm. So the judge can disagree on an issue of law because, of course, they don't care what you or the prosecutor have to say about that. And their eyes are usually going to glass over anyway. But when the judge, and I got to tell you, maybe one of you guys can answer this. Why, when it's so easy to just lie or to spin, do they not do that? Let me give you a prime example, and this is something that I went through this morning, and they do a very good job of this, and it snows most people. I would say, 99% of people out there are going to get snowed by this. You put forth an issue of fact, and they respond with an issue of law that you never raise. And that's typical with what I go through, where we'll say, and this is what I had to say to this guy Tom this morning. He said, I said, this is a very subtle way of being misleading. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you come back with that my client's position was he's not a taxpayer. And it's got a kernel of truth to it. It's, it sounds close. I said, but when you break it down and you look at his real position, you can see where you're subtly trying to mislead someone who's reading this. He's just, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I believed him. I said, well, let me explain. You know that my client's position was there was no evidence he's a taxpayer. Yet you left that part out, the part about evidence. You just want it to be a blind assertion. That and it's not what he put forth. It's a very different thing to say there's no evidence he's a taxpayer than to just make a statement he's not a taxpayer. Why would you leave that part out?
Right.
Right? And now, the point, I'm just trying to draw an analogy because if you look at the actual law that people seem to have so much respect for, where you look at the Supreme Court, and I know you've pulled out tons of Supreme Court cases when you do this, but one of the important ones is, and this is my point, is where the Supreme Court in Cook v. Tate pretty much gives anybody who's pro-taxes the ammunition that they need to shut down tax protesters because it very clearly lays out that the citizen is liable for the income tax. Now, there's no long drawn-out thing connecting the two, but that's not my point. My point is, why in the world don't they just pull out Cook v. Tate and ram it down the jury's throat and everybody else to an attempt to spin their way to a conviction or to convince people? Why don't they just do that and make it easy for themselves instead of making it where they're avoiding answering the questions?
See, I think there's a step that comes before them avoiding responding to us. Incidentally, I think they don't mention Cook v. Tate because it's about an American in Mexico. And they don't want that brought up that, hey, this isn't even about domestic commerce. But way before that, I think whether it's low-level bureaucrat or judge or anybody in between, I don't think they're sitting there carefully planning how to not answer our questions. I think the way their own minds work, they are not at all interested in understanding what's true or in even understanding what we're saying or what we're asking. Their goal is the minimum amount of things they can say or write down which will make people shut up and go away so they can keep being the pawn of the oppressor, a gear in the machine, without having to actually think about anything. Because, and in my trial, the judge went on a diatribe about income taxes where he got everything under the sun completely wrong. Said, well, they didn't have the power to do an income tax to begin with. Some amendment gave it to them. I can't remember which amendment it was or when it happened. And he just went on this series of things, all of which were completely wrong. And I was sitting right next to him, and of course I wasn't allowed to say, you don't have any idea what you're talking about, Your Honor. But it was obvious he didn't care if it was true. What he wanted is a thing to make the discussion go away because he didn't want to think about it. He didn't want the jurors thinking about it. He just wanted to be able to say, here's what it is. Now, can we be done this whole talking about stuff thing? because I don't like talking about stuff or thinking about stuff. And I think it's the same down to the lowest level moronic bureaucrat. All they want is something